Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about a major development in the legal challenge to Justin Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act. Trudeau used this extraordinary law in February of 2022 to criminalize protests and freeze bank accounts in response to the Freedom Convoy, a group of protesters in big rig trucks who protested in downtown Ottawa and blockaded some border crossings. They were protesting a new government vaccine mandate for truckers, as well as other pandemic related restrictions. The Emergencies Act is an extraordinary law that allows the Prime Minister and Cabinet to create new criminal law basically with the snap of their fingers. It's only available when the high thresholds in that law are met: insurrection, terrorism, war, or massive natural disasters. Trudeau used the Emergencies Act for what's called a public order emergency. But did one actually exist? A legal charity that I work for, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, said no. And in January of 2024, the federal court agreed, finding that Trudeau had illegally invoked the act and used it to create unconstitutional regulations. That case has now been appealed to the Federal Court of Appeal, where it was heard last week. Here today to discuss the case are Joanna Baron of the Canadian Constitution Foundation and Sujit Choudhry, who represented us in that case. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Sujit, let's start with you. Can you explain what the Emergencies Act did when it was invoked? What were those regulations that were created?
Sure. So the act was invoked in February 2022 in the wake of protests across Canada in opposition to pandemic era restrictions at the border and other mandates. And when the act was invoked, the cabinet then used kind of extraordinary powers it granted to restrict peaceful assembly and expression across Canada, not just where the protests were taking place, and also to freeze the bank accounts of hundreds of Canadians who'd broken no other law.
Now, Joanna, maybe you can give a little bit of color to how those regulations actually played out in practice. What did their application look like when they came into force?
So they were extremely broad in scope and were applied extremely broadly. So, for example, the emergency measures captured people who did not create blockades and who were just showing up on Parliament Hill peacefully protesting, allowed police officers to arrest anyone and prohibit any assemblies that could reasonably lead to a breach of the peace, which is obviously a very wide standard. And then the economic measures, which were the most notorious part of probably this whole affair, directed bank accounts to freeze, directed banks to freeze bank accounts of specified individuals. And it's important to emphasize that these were not just limited to blockade participants, and the government's disclosure of this information required extensive personal information. It required extensive information about people's
Mhm.
license plate numbers, social insurance numbers, really sweeping.
Now, Suji, this was the first time this piece of legislation had ever been used, and the history of the Emergencies Act is actually crucial to understand. And for this case, what can you tell me about that history?
Sure. So just on the first point, it's important to remember that, Canada has faced terrorist threats. We had 9/11. We've had sort of serious threats to national security since the act was enacted in 1988, but it was never invoked. It was only invoked in response to these protests, which were for where there was no serious violence and no serious destruction of property. And so the act was enacted in 1988, and it was a direct repudiation of the War Measures Act, which was the federal emergency legislation that had been invoked in the First World War to intern German Canadians, in the Second World War to intern Italian and Japanese Canadians, and then most recently in 1970 in the October crisis in Quebec. And sort of in a nutshell, the October crisis was precipitated by a terrorist threat by the FLQ, which had engaged in a campaign of bombings, kidnappings, and murder to fight for an independent Quebec. And the act was invoked, and there were mass arrests of hundreds of people.
Mhm.
At the end, there were very few convictions, and the FLQ was alleged to be a state within a state, but there were really just a handful of FAQ members.
Right.
And so basically the bottom line was that we panicked overreacted in
Hmm.
1970. And the point of the act was not to do that again.
We've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back.